Hello and welcome to the podcast. I'm here as always with co-host John Micton, live from Switzerland. How are you doing, John?
Good, Dan. And you're live from Prague. And
Yeah.
one thing that we've always, I think one thing that you have always been interested in, and I am too, is kind of the trends of international schools and how they have, changed over time. We've had guests talk about nonprofit, profit, and we just had somebody on admissions. We talk with a lot of different people that kind of talk about the lifespan or the narrative of international schools. And one organization that Dan and I have always, respected and always been keen to connect with is ISC Research. Sorry. And they do some phenomenal work, and they've been doing work for over 25 years on data analysis of international schools. So it's a real privilege to have Nalini Cook with us today to talk a bit about this. And Nalini, a warm welcome to the International School Podcast.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
So Dan, I know this is a burning topic for you. Go for it. What do you want to know about international schools and trends?
Well, John, I think you've got also a lot of questions. I mean, from my point of view, I guess, Nalini, it's interesting. What could you give us what's kind of the big picture? I know obviously, there's a general trend of international schools were originally for the children of expatriates, NGOs, company, and it's obviously grown to be much more local and much bigger. Is it possible for you just to give us a kind of an overall summary of what kind of the evolution of international schools are over time? That for me would be a super interesting place to start.
Absolutely. It's a really interesting one. There are arguments about who was the very first international school. The general consensus seems to be the International School of Geneva, founded in the 1920s, although there is evidence of internationally inclined schools existing in places like London before that. But really, until about 20 to 30 years ago, they were few and far between, and they catered very much to an expatriate market, a Western expatriate market, of people who went to different countries for employment purposes, and essentially taking their families there, their children couldn't access the local education because they didn't have the language skills, or because it was going to be a 2-year or a 3-year stint or contract.
Yeah.
And then they would have to re-enter their home country's education system. So there needed to be some continuity. And so lots of international schools were founded upon that basis. A lot of them, especially if you go back 30 or 40 years ago, were created by parents themselves, specifically to answer this need. They were created by companies, particularly companies like oil and gas, defense companies, really to answer a very specific need. And what we've seen emerge over the last 30 years or so is a recognition of international education for its own sake, rather than through necessity. And so increasingly, as you mentioned earlier, Dan, we're seeing local nationals wanting to attend international schools, not because they're cut out of the local curriculum, not because an employer is paying for this type of education, but simply because they recognize a value in international education and what that might give their children. And that's where it's exploded really in the last few years.
What, Nalini, on that explosion, so there have been there are nonprofit schools, so the kind of the original schools that opened up for expats and companies, and now they're very for-profit. And it seems that the for-profit is where the growth is. Do you have any data or explanation why that is, and why are nonprofits? Is it just the fact that it's nonprofit, it's more difficult to expand?
You're absolutely right in terms of how that's developed. Most of the original schools were not-for-profit. There are still non-profit schools being founded, but they are few and far between. And a lot of the time that is down to simply the fact that it can be harder to get licenses for non-profit schools. We're seeing an explosion of school groups and independent school brands, certainly over the last 5 to 10 years. They are for profit for a reason, and certainly In the case of some groups, they have shareholders, they're publicly on the market as such, they're publicly listed. But there's also, I think it's important to note that it isn't quite as binary as it sometimes seems. There are a lot of for-profit schools, or certainly schools that we at ISC Research would term for profit, and I think most people would, who, whilst on paper they're for profit and that's the license they have, do fundamentally operate in the same way as a not-for-profit, whereby all profits generated are put back into the school and don't necessarily go to an owner's pocket or shareholders. They are used to improve the quality of education that's provided.
Interesting.
That's interesting. I've heard the same thing. And also, there's definitely a case of a lot of not-for-profit. I'm not talking about any schools here, but just if you take the not-for-profit sector in general across the world, there's a lot of not-for-profits that are not-for-profit, but they have huge consultancy fees paid out. So they are actually effectively a for-profit for somebody. And I've heard even of a couple of schools that have been described like that. So I think it's interesting what you say, that it's not always like the clear-cut distinction, especially with the for-profit schools.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree with that.
So Nalini, maybe you can talk a bit about the history of your organization, because 25 years is a long time. I have, as a school leader, I've gone to many leadership conferences, and I know your organization always does kind of a, as we say in French, an état des lieux, kind of the state of play, and you get the statistics and the patterns of how many teachers you might be anticipating, the growth. And so tell us a bit about how did this come about? And I think you might be one of the more unique organizations in this field specific to international schools.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We are the only organization who researches the international schools English medium market, solely doing that. There are, of course, some huge consultancies who have that in their portfolio, but we focus solely on the English medium international schools market. We're very specific. We've been doing it for almost 30 years now. Next year, 2024, will be our 30-year anniversary. And it came about through chance, really. Our chairman, Nick Brummett, who I think a lot of people will still know in the international school circuit, was at the time working as a salesman for a publisher and going round to international schools. And while he was doing that and visiting these schools 29 years ago, and as he became more friendly with the schools themselves, they were asking him, well, hang on, you've been to this another 10 schools in this city, or you've been to this particular country. What's going on there? How are they doing compared to us? And as a result, he started collecting data and information on the market, and that's how it began. Our head office is based in Farringdon in Oxfordshire in the UK, simply because the company was actually started in a shed at the bottom of Nick Brummett's garden almost 30 years ago. We've now expanded. When I joined 9 years ago, I joined the organisation, we were about 15 people. We're now almost 60 people around the world. We have a hub still in Farringdon, no longer in the shed, now in proper premises. We have a hub in the Philippines, and then we have people based around the world in places like Hungary, Spain, the US, China, India. I'm speaking to you from Dubai in the UAE today. So we've grown exponentially as the school market has grown, really. And it started with a desire to find out information about what was going on in the international schools market. And that's still very much our mission, which is to provide accurate, reliable data and intelligence on the international schools market to benefit the schools themselves, to benefit anybody who is working with or supplying into that market so that they can make informed strategic decisions.
Yeah, that's so interesting, because I think nowadays many schools understand the power of data, and that can really help as they kind of, align themselves for strategic planning, having that data, especially if they look at competition or maybe salary scales, or even it might be availability of teachers for recruitment and those kind of things. what metrics are you using? Are you doing this kind of through any softwares or surveys, or are you now introducing some artificial intelligence? Just kind of, how is this data collected? And you don't have to give away the state secrets, but kind of on a surface level, kind of some ideas how you're collating this and what technologies you might be using.
Well, again, we've definitely progressed, certainly in the last decade. Like when I joined, we were very much still using Excel spreadsheets. And we still do to a certain extent, of course, they're always useful. But we now have a whole development team who are currently actually redesigning our systems for us, and we'll have new systems online. So anybody who's already using our platforms will see new front ends to those systems in the next couple of months. But we are definitely using tools like Power BI. Trying to think, this is not my area of expertise. But we're definitely starting to harness AI. What I would say, and I think what makes us different, is whilst we're using those types of tools to save time, and we use things like SurveyMonkey sometimes for specific surveys, the core part of our research, and still the main part, easily 80 to 90%, is undertaken by real life human beings and individuals, whether it is sitting at a screen and looking at school websites, whether it's calling up schools to find out what's going on, or in the case of my team, I head up the field research team. It's actually physically going into the schools and taking a school tour and talking to various international school leaders to find out what it is that's important to them at the moment, what patterns, trends are changing, what are their current challenges, those types of things. And ultimately, that just really can't be gathered by AI. It's a super useful tool, and certainly something that we can then organize some of this data with, but actually gathering the data is still very much a human endeavor at the moment. I think will be for, perhaps not for eternity, but certainly I think over the next few decades, I don't think that can be replaced by AI.
Interesting. I'm curious, Nalini, obviously you're in Dubai. I'm actually going to Dubai on Sunday. I'm going to be there for a few days, and also Saudi Arabia and Bahrain. What are the I'm keen to a bit more about the trends you mentioned before. Like, could you say a bit more about like what kind of regions are having the growth in international schools and what's driving, and also like what countries specifically? Because I know it's kind of, you might say one region, but within that, for example, I mean, Saudi Arabia, it seems to me, has got tons of new schools opening. So like, what are the trends you're seeing, and how has that sort of evolved since you've been involved in for the last 9 years or 10 years?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, certainly going back a few years, almost everything was focused on China.
Yeah.
China was the sort of the big ticket that everybody was looking at for opening schools. If you were a teacher looking to go overseas, you were looking at China, and that's completely flipped in the last few years. Firstly, thanks to COVID. I don't think that will be a surprise to anybody. But the increasing regulation that we're finding there,
that's what I've heard. Yeah.
It's making it harder to open a school. Certainly, if you are a Chinese national, you can't attend an international curriculum school without certain exceptions. And it's quite complicated now, not only to open and run a school there, but increasingly to recruit teachers there. We've seen a mass exodus of teachers from that region.
Yep.
Interestingly, there are still, I think off the top of my head, I think we've still got 28 future schools on our radar due to open in the next 2 years.
Wow.
So it's certainly not come to a grinding halt. It's just a lot more challenging in China, and people are having to find innovative ways to cope with the regulation and the challenges of the recruitment.
Sure.
But in terms of where else we're seeing the growth, I would say at the moment the most extreme growth is most definitely in Asia as a whole, and if we broke that down, it would be Southeast Asia and what we would term Western Asia, which is the Middle East, excluding Egypt. And within, again, those sub-regions, Vietnam is a big one. They had a legislation change a few years ago enabling Vietnamese children to attend international schooling. Certainly up to 50% of your enrollment can now be Vietnamese children. So that's booming. Japan looks to be growing. Interestingly, that was quite closed off for quite a long time. Last academic year, we had the first UK brand school open there. There are another 2 UK brand schools that have opened this academic year.
Interesting.
So that's starting to get going. And interestingly there, the demand isn't necessarily coming from Japanese nationals or indeed typical expats who are there on a work contract. What we're seeing is an increasing number of people exiting China because they can't access international education and moving temporarily or boarding and looking to go to international schools within Japan, South Korea, Thailand and Vietnam seem to be the big ones.
Interesting. I was just in last year in Cambodia, and I was at an education event. It was actually at the British ambassador's residence, and there was a British school. I think it was Shrewsbury. I can't remember. And they were setting up a boarding school in Cambodia, and just what you said, their target market was Chinese people sending their children overseas to the boarding school. So it's interesting. There's such a demand for Chinese families to get international education, and and it's obviously a long way to send them to Europe or US. So if it's something in the region where they can get back easier, and it's probably cheaper as well, I'm sure it's a huge market now.
Absolutely, it's a really interesting phenomenon. There's a whole industry growing up around it. I mean, if you look at Jeju in South Korea, we're seeing housing developments come up, particularly populated by things like golf courses and they're particularly aimed at these Chinese expatriate families where it might be the grandparents or it might be mum who comes there during term time. They buy a condo or an apartment, child goes to school or children go to school there. And then in holidays, they're not too far, they fly home. And yeah, best of both worlds. It's a really interesting development.
Yeah, I'd never connected the dots because we work a lot in Korea, and John, I know you've been, and we run a Google Summit in Korea almost every year, and I was always wondering why Jeju, obviously it's a tourist destination and everything, but why are there so many international schools? And I was kind of thinking, does the tourist industry support this many people? And I wasn't actually thinking that a lot of Chinese people were sending their,
Yeah, that's right. It's a free zone.
So many international
free zone. Yeah, it's fascinating how this is developing, and we're starting to get inquiries from people who are looking at opening schools, particularly targeted at these students. So there will be elements of the Chinese curriculum and language provision alongside the international curriculum. Fascinating.
Yeah. Sorry, John.
One thing you talked about is the UK branded schools. And I know that, a lot of public schools, and for our audience, a public school in England is actually a private school. That's always, but the private English schools, the Harrows, the Haileyburys, the Eatons, and the Dulwiches, you now are seeing them going out and kind of franchising themselves. Can you talk about what was kind of the strategic idea? Is it generally income generation, or is it also because that curriculum is so well appreciated that they see that brand of curriculum also a value-added proposition in the markets that they're going?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a combination of all of the above and a few additional factors. I think it's worth knowing that in the UK, those public schools, which are private schools, we like to make it as tricky as possible in the UK, are generally charities. So the way that they're run is quite particular. They can't make profit, and certainly, again, a trend there over the last couple of decades is that proportionate to income, the tuition fees for those schools has become much higher, meaning that the market is shrinking in the UK. It's hard for them financially. So initially, I think for the majority of schools, there's certainly a financial element to that decision to go overseas, a desire to create an additional revenue stream, basically. in addition to tuition fee income. We do also deal with a lot of US independent schools and Australian independent schools, slightly different motivations there, but they all do have in common the desire to increase that brand awareness. So firstly, there's a desire to improve brand awareness overseas so that there will be some students who might then look at the home school in the home country. So it's just a marketing strategy to a certain degree. There's also, the charter for a lot of these schools, their mission, their purpose of being is specifically to educate people without profit. And so even when you find those schools opening schools overseas, that is still their main motivation. It is to share quality education. Any profits that are made, I think it's, because they're in the UK, certainly they're charities, it's worth knowing that whilst they might be profit making overseas, those profits are going back into the schools as a whole. They are used to, support teacher recruitment, development of facilities, fund resources, etc. So there's some very, very different motivations out there, but certainly it helps in terms of bringing students to the home schools. There's also been a little bit of a trend, and COVID exacerbated this significantly, which is that families are less keen to send their children to board in the UK or in the US, Canada, Australia. They want that same quality and standard of education, but they want it a little bit closer to home, so that if something like a pandemic happens, children are a little bit more accessible. So we've seen a significant shift of people who perhaps historically would have sent their children to board overseas, now looking for that same kind of product in their local markets. So I think
interesting.
those are the main motivations.
That's interesting. John, we had obviously Denry Machin on the podcast, who's written a few academic papers on this topic of the for-profit schools. Really interesting guy. And, it's just interesting because he was saying, or someone was saying that there was only a very few schools at British or whatever private schools who managed them directly. I think the only real one was Marlborough College in Malaysia. And almost all the other ones were partnering with a local entity, which would everything from private equity to real estate developers to all kinds of things, who were there with local people, and it was their business basically. They were paying a franchise fee to the school, and the school was providing quality control. They were sending a share of the profits. Is that still the model? Is that still how it's kind of working for most schools?
Very much so, because schools typically don't have the funds to manage everything from land purchase to the school build and management thereon. So they will typically offer their services as a joint venture with a developer, an investor, etc. But the services that they provide can be, and usually are, quite comprehensive in that they will, they would be a part of designing the school building, making sure it, fits with the style of education being offered. They would appoint the head. They'll often appoint senior leaders as well. There will be governors from the home school. There'll be regular quality assurance visits out. Curricula will be shared. Things like university pathways, college counsellors, careers advisors, etc., might be shared or at least trained from the home school. So there's a real desire to put the home school's ethos and quality stamp in the branch school, typically.
Interesting. Are there any non-Western franchises or companies? There are GEMS is an example of these big corporations that tend to be more. GEMS is not I think it's owned by a Indian entity.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering, is any are the Chinese franchising international schools? Are the Indians? Is there because we are talking very much about a Western kind of approach. Is there the opposite, maybe more of an Indian approach or more a Chinese approach in that international school market?
Yes, and an emerging. Yes, I think is the answer to that. Not in quite the same way. We don't have those schools that have been around for hundreds of years who are really taking that entire brand ethos, curriculum, etc. across. But we are starting to see, for example, there is a Chinese school that has opened in Dubai. Now, it's not really a brand in and of itself, but they are bringing that expertise over. The Indian, and the name escapes me, but global, might come to me during the conversation. There's a global school from India that is opening in Singapore. So we are seeing that start to emerge. It's not as big a trend as the Western brands yet, but it is starting to emerge. I think it's also worth bearing in mind that whilst they get a lot of airtime, the Western branded schools that are expanding, there are still only, it's under 150 around the world. They're not a huge percentage of the market. It's something like 1.3, 1.4% of the total market. They're just very visible.
Yeah. It's interesting, John. I've noticed a lot in the Middle East recently when I've been the number of a lot of schools focused on Indian expatriates families. I was in Bahrain. Bahrain has like several schools. They're not. Sometimes they are called an Indian school, sometimes not. But their target, their target student or the target parents are Indians, kind of working in the country, and they follow the Indian national curriculum, which you really need to do if you want to get into an Indian university and stuff. So it seems like it's really a growing thing. Is that just in the Middle East, Nalini, or is that in other places as well?
I'd say it's very prevalent in the Middle East, certainly in the Gulf states. The people who originate from the Indian subcontinent tend to make up around 60 to 70% of the populations here. Bearing in mind that the populations are largely 80% plus expatriates, with the exception of Saudi. It's a little bit of a funny market, but we see similar, maybe not to quite such a large extent in places like Singapore, Malaysia, increasingly Thailand as well. Interesting.
Saudi, is it less a lower percentage of expats in Saudi? I presume that's what you mean. Yeah, interesting. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, there's a much larger percentage of Saudis themselves. I can't remember the figure off the top of my head, but I would say in around the region of 60% are Saudis versus 40% expats. And of course, a huge youth population of Saudis themselves there, which is what's driving the huge growth in Saudi at the moment.
I think it's going to be, just I can see myself. I mean, I'm going to be there next week actually in Jeddah and Riyadh, and up until last year, you couldn't even get a tourist visa for Saudi. Now, if you want to visit, you apply online, you get it instantly, multi-entry visa, multiple entries. And it's so, the growth that it seems everyone's talking about it. They're building a whole new city there. I've heard people say they're even going to be selling alcohol there soon. Whether or not that's going to happen, but I've heard several people say it's going to happen this year.
There's a lot of rumours to that effect. The country is most certainly opening up. As you say, it used to be incredibly challenging to get a visa. It used to be a difficult place, I think, if you were a Westerner, certainly.
Sure.
To live and work. It was seen as a hardship posting. I was there just a few months back, and certainly these days, as a woman, not only can you drive, I could walk around, without having my head covered. I was wearing trousers and a blouse. It's really opening up, and the PIF there, which is the Public Investment Fund, is literally pumping money into so many developments there. They really do want to develop the country and become more welcoming to the outside world. So definitely one to watch.
Interesting.
One thing, we're hearing about all this expansion of schools and growth and, franchising, etc. You need teachers, right, for these schools. Talk to us a bit about the teacher market, because, in many countries, you have a lot of teacher shortages, often not because there's not teachers available. It's the challenges of working in the UK. I've been following a lot about some of the issues of the government organization that kind of accredits schools, and there are issues of socioeconomic challenges within the classroom. So there is this kind of talk of teacher shortage. Is that the case in international schools, but for a different reason, or is it still a tight market for teachers?
I think The overarching thing to remember here is that there is a shortage of teachers, whether it's a domestic market or an international market. There is no question about that. And that's only going to get tougher in the coming years as schools are opening at a rate of knots, and we just don't have the teachers trained and qualified, nor are enough coming through the training system as that goes. So without a doubt, there is a teacher recruitment crisis, quite an alarming word, but certainly a shortage. There are nuances to that in the international schools market. In China at the moment, it's incredibly difficult to find quality teachers. Salaries have always been the highest in the world. And of course, when you're recruiting for international schools, you're recruiting on a global stage. You're not recruiting solely from your own country or your own region. And I think certainly recent conversations have indicated from school leaders that there is a limit. There's a point at which you top out and you cannot pay teachers anymore, no matter how willing the school owners are, no matter how deep their pockets are. There does come a point where no matter how much you're paying, you're still not getting the quality and the standard of teachers that you want. In the Middle East, we're currently enjoying a little bit of a halcyon time, I think, right now. As you alluded to, there's lots of cost of living crises, there's conflict in Europe, lots of things going on that make the Middle East seem very attractive to people at the moment. So less of a challenge here, although I would still say places like Kuwait and Saudi are challenging to get the right people in.
Fascinating. About a question about Dubai, because I mean, what really interests me, I was in Dubai, might be getting the dates wrong, but I think about 2 years ago, just post-COVID, and a lot of the schools were having real crisis. They were reducing their fees. They were under enrolled. And then I went back a year later, and the picture had changed completely. Where everyone's schools were full, there were waiting lists, new schools were opening, and people were attributing to the Ukraine war, Ukrainian and Russian families both leaving. Am I kind of painting the right picture, or was there other factors in there?
Absolutely. Dubai, as you know, is an incredibly new city, certainly as far as development goes. And I've been here 20 years, and we have these real extreme peaks and troughs, and it's no different at the moment. We're currently in a real peak. It's boom, there's buoyancy everywhere. It's a real bullish market. But post-COVID, we had a lot of internal churn with people who wanted to leave, not necessarily leaving the country. It was all a little bit too uncertain. But we're currently experiencing huge amounts of people turning up without jobs, turning up without really a great big plan. They're literally just turning up and trying their luck. That's how much people want to be here.
So it's like the Gold Rush mentality, like San Francisco.
Absolutely. It was definitely driven 18 months ago by the Ukraine and Russia, certainly by, again, a number of Chinese nationals coming here wanting to perhaps escape some of the border restrictions, controls on wealth, etc. But increasingly now that boom is ongoing. There are still people from those places arriving, but we're also seeing a lot more people arriving from Western Europe and various other parts of the globe. So a real boom here. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah.
So Dan's in the Czech Republic, I'm in Switzerland, and I assume that Europe is not the big growth market anymore.
It is still growing, not to the same extent. I think from memory, our figures were around 4% growth over the last 5 years for Europe. So there's definitely still growth. We're definitely still seeing an increasing number of local nationals looking at international schooling. That is bringing the average fees down, which makes things a little bit more challenging. It's harder to recruit. Brexit's had an impact. In the US, we're seeing a lot of teachers in the coming from the US being offered golden handshakes, bonuses and things to stay in domestic markets. So the recruitment crisis is still there, but interestingly, I do have conversations with school leaders sometimes who say, yeah, our problem isn't so much recruitment, it's actually getting people to turn over. A typical attrition rate at a school internationally would probably be around 10 to 12%, something in that region. Anything above 20, people start to get a little bit worried. I have spoken to schools in Western Europe in particular who are saying we've got less than 1% of an attrition rate. And there are challenges with that as well.
Sure.
Yeah.
We're almost at the end, and we did talk before we got on the air about the Eduruptors, and I appreciate that you're not involved with the program, but I know a lot of people, it gets a lot of traffic. Dan and I feel privileged. We both were nominated. So maybe you can just tell us a bit about what that is and why. And I understand there's another group that really delves into it, but just kind of for people that might not be familiar with the term or the award.
So Eduruptors is something that ISC Research has been running for 3 years, I think now. And we essentially look to identify key people in the international schools world who are disrupting education and the way education is run. We look in terms of metrics. We base it on social media, just as something that we can track so that it is objective rather than subjective. And we track platforms like Twitter, LinkedIn. There's a number of them. I'm not a social media person, so I can't think of things off the top of my head. But I know that they track those, looking to see how many followers people have, how much engagement they get with their posts, how many posts are reposted, and the types of topics and trends that those people are investigating and sharing and exploring. What's underpinning this is we're ideally looking to highlight people who are bringing something new and innovative to the market, or sharing that so that it's accessible to more and more people. So the idea is that we produce this list of, I think it's 100 people every year. There is no judgment from our side as a company as to say, this person is fantastic versus that person. It's simply that these people are sharing the most ideas that the most people find interesting, informative, and helpful. And so in that way, we're tracking people who are key in school development, who are key in trends like artificial intelligence, staff recruitment, curriculum development, assessments. Could be anything under the sun. And we're just trying to get a handle on that. And so therefore we produce this paper, this white paper every year that shows those people and hopefully serves as something of a guide for those who may be new to the market or wanting to explore more and to explore the trends and what's happening currently, to be able to identify trends and people to be able to follow. And then of course we run the Eduruptors conference virtually every summer in June, again highlighting some of the things that have emerged from that paper that's published in January.
Fantastic. Great. Thank you. So I just want to remind our audience that Nalini has been very generous. There's show notes with links. You can also follow them at their website. And if you have not spent time on their website, I definitely encourage you. It's iscresearch.com. There's so much there that you can really learn about. And of course, you can reach out to them if you're interested in this fantastic learning that we've just had about the metrics and kind of the patterns that are occurring in international schools. Dan, I don't know if you have any last questions before we wrap up.
No, super. I could have talked for another hour. I've got loads of questions we didn't even get around to. I'm fascinated by the international school growth and everything. So definitely hope to get you on again, Nalini, and we can ask you more questions.
I'd love to. It's been an absolute pleasure. And if anybody's listening in from an international school, I'd just like to highlight that all of these resources are available for you completely freely. White papers, research papers, data on the schools market. There's a community platform, all kinds of things. Just head to the website and please do make use of it. That's the reason that we produce this research. We hope you find it useful.
Yeah, and that's extremely generous, and definitely for school leaders, if you're looking at strategic development, or you are maybe an investor or maybe an educator that wants to start your own school, you have to go to this website. I think you just learned so much. Nalini, thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to more conversations. And again, to our audience, thank you for all the significant increase in LinkedIn subscriptions. So we really appreciate that people are excited about the guests that we bring to you and the conversations. And we so appreciate all the feedback and the reshares and the reposts. But Nalini, have a wonderful rest of the week. And thank you so much for sharing your expertise and highlighting your organization.
Thank you.
Thank you.